So welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute, and welcome to the first Science on the Sound in a while, right? Everybody sort of lost COVID time, but it certainly was before that. And so welcome. My name is Reide Corbett. I'm the executive director out here at the Coastal Studies Institute. And we're thrilled to sort of be back face-to-face, trying to provide opportunities to engage with our community and talk about some of the science that we're doing. And so we hope that you'll continue to follow these. These are going to be roughly monthly. We do have one planned for next month and the month after, so look for those and hope you can make them. Another thing I wanted to mention is on October 22nd, we have something taking place called BioBlitz. This is an opportunity to try and bring people to our campus to use this app called iNaturalist to get an idea of the biodiversity that we have on our campus. And so you sort of come out with your phone with this app on it. You can snap pictures of animals, and it really will provide a really interesting database for the different animals that we have on our campus. This is all being led by a high school student, Fenton, at First Flight High. Anyway, he's been leading this effort. He's an incredible student with a lot of energy and loves all sorts of animals. So he's the one that's really leading this effort. We're excited to have him take part. And if you spread the word, it's on our website. You can get some more information there. All right, so I'm here tonight to talk about something that, well, has been ongoing all summer, the idea of beach nourishment on the Outer Banks. And to sort of, maybe I might get more questions than I answer throughout this presentation, but sort of to try and address some of the what, why, and from our perspective and some of our data that we've collected over the last several years, some of the potential impacts, or not for that matter. There's a lot of people that's been involved in this research. We've actually been sampling a couple stretches of the Outer Banks since 2014. And so the names there are several of the people that I've been working with over the years, collecting these samples and doing some of the analysis. I'll start sort of with just some introductory stuff. Much of it you probably know, much of it might just be sort of review, but I think it's important that we hit on it as we get into maybe the significance of nourishment and maybe some of those impacts. When we look at coastal regions generally, and this is typically defined by, within about 50 miles of a shoreline. The coastal population has doubled or more than doubled since 1960. With that doubling or more than doubling, you can imagine the infrastructure that's been put in place along our coastlines since 1960 as well. Beaches account for 85% of tourism revenue in coastal states in the US, 85%, and that's true in North Carolina as well, with Dare County accounting for more than $1 billion in tourism revenue. When you think about that from a coastal system like this, there's often a lot of competing uses, competing resources. Some of those might be your typical tourism, actively using the beach, the near shore, some of the many activities, outdoor activities that we have along our shores, to maybe some of the resources that we have offshore, some of the maritime heritage resources, some of those fisheries resources. And you can think of that from a recreation versus commercial, for that matter. And then more recently is thinking about some of the other resources that might come online, whether it's offshore wind. We've been through some interesting things regarding offshore potential oil and natural gas, some of those resources. And certainly, as we continue talking about the topic tonight, beach nourishment, is some of the mining. And that's really what we're doing offshore, is mining for sand. And a lot of data goes into that, and a lot of understanding of some of the influences, impacts associated with all of these different needs. And there's a lot of scientific background that's needed to understand some of those potential conflicts. So focus in a little bit on barrier islands themselves. Barrier islands represent about 10% of global ocean shorelines, and so it doesn't seem like a lot, but the fact is that is fairly significant across the globe. And oh, you're counting. I was like, question? It's fairly significant across the globe, and they are fairly unique ecosystems. Barrier islands are constantly changing, and in fact, they are a product of sea level rise. And we've seen, and we can sort of map that, and those of you that have spent any time along the front side of the Outer Banks, whether it's down around the Hatteras area, up around Corolla, you'll find stumps, you'll find old marsh sediments on the front side of the barriers. And I think most of us know that those didn't start there, right? We don't have trees growing on the front side of our barrier islands. And that's a product of how these barriers have changed through history, throughout some of geologic time. And it's a product, ultimately, of sea level rise on longer timescales. The morphology, or how these islands were developed, how they're changing moving forward, is a product of a lot of different things. We'll talk about some of those today and some of the impacts of these. You know, storms, wave energy, we're sort of dealing with some of these today, tonight, this weekend. Other things that we're really interested in as well, the idea of inlet dynamics, sediment supply, where these sediments are coming, where they're going. All of these things lead to the dynamics that we experience on a day-to-day basis, let alone over scales like decades. For the Outer Banks themselves, again, many of us, this is sort of review, the idea that we have about 300 kilometers of barrier islands. Interestingly, for the Outer Banks is not only do we have this very large water body, the Atlantic Ocean, off one side of our barrier, but we have a very significant water body off the other side of the barrier, which is the Albemarle-Pamlico estuarine system. This is the second largest estuarine system in the US. And when you compare that to the first largest, Chesapeake Bay, right, the dynamics are extremely different. This extremely large water body is only open to the Atlantic by a few inlets. And so it's not driven by astronomical tides, it's driven by things that are going on right now, winds, right? And so if you look at the water levels today compared to what they were just 12 hours ago, it's winds that drives these water levels in our system. And with changes to weather patterns, wind patterns, sea level rise, we're gonna see some of those changes really influence the APES, the Albemarle-Pamlico estuarine system, in the future. Certainly on the Outer Banks, we know there are millions of visitors. We've seen that increase just in the last couple of years. I saw that report that Lee Nettles put out from, I think it was July, right, where we saw, we had as much as, was it 200 million for just July? That was for the number of people that are residing here on the Outer Banks, brought in as much as 200 million, which was a new record for the Outer Banks. One of the things that we'll see, and I'll show you this in just a second, is that there are certainly chronic erosion problems along the Outer Banks. It's not unique to the Outer Banks. It's not unique to North Carolina. The idea of erosion along coastal systems is dominant around the world. And that's leading to some interesting challenges that we face, as well as many coastal communities. Along those lines, I'll put this really up front, and I'll probably bring it up a couple times. The idea when thinking about coastal erosion along the Atlantic shoreline for us is that we don't allow hardened structures, right? These engineered hardened structures like seawalls on that particular shoreline. That's pretty significant and different than a lot of other states. That ban went in place, I think, in 1985. It went into law in 2003, I believe, and it hasn't changed since. There's been some modifications for terminal groins and things like that, but generally we do not allow hardened structures along our Atlantic shoreline. So that's important to sort of put in the back of your mind as we go through some of this. One of the things I want to point out is that as we sort of talk about these dynamics, it's always good to have the broader scale, sort of on geologic time frame, as these islands have changed a lot. Within North Carolina, our shorelines have changed a lot. There's a lot of information here. The first thing I want to point out is this is obviously showing coastal North Carolina. The different colors represent elevation. You can see that coastal North Carolina, particularly in the Northeast, is very low lying. It's also showing the bathymetry, so the depth offshore. The graphs over to the left here represent changes in CO2, changes in the average global temperature, and changes in sea level over a very long time scale, 150,000 years. So it's important to recognize that sea level has changed significantly on this sort of geologic time scale, right? Looking over the last 150,000 years. So back about 120,000 years ago, sea level was much higher, and then back just 15,000 years ago, sea level was much lower. And so if you look at those two different time periods and sort of put that onto these maps, that represents these two different shorelines. So these are what we would refer to as paleo shorelines, basically the shelf break is an old shoreline, about 130 meters water depth today. That was a shoreline about 15,000 years ago. Step back in time about to 150,000, 130,000 years ago, and you have to move way inland to what's referred to as the Suffolk Scarp, which represents a paleo shoreline from the last interglacial period. And so we've had some tremendous changes in sea level in our geologic history. And again, recall that these barrier islands are a product of sea level rise, so it's really, our barrier islands are fairly young and really began developing only about 5,000, 6,000 years ago is when our barriers were created. And they've continued to change since that time. So modern day, right, so we're still faced with some of these same challenges that these barriers have faced for the last many thousands of years. And this is driven by the fact that we have a fairly low-lying coastal system. The underlying geology is a product of some of the things I showed you before, right, in that previous slide, is how sea level has changed. But if you look at the barrier here, we talk about, we live on a ribbon of sand. It truly is. Our barriers are truly made up of a pile of sand. It is a sandbar that is above sea level, right? It truly is. And we are in an area that sticks out into the Atlantic fairly far, certainly relative to our neighbors to the north and south. We're in an area that does see significant storms. We're sort of experiencing that today. And we're also experiencing sea level. And so this is looking at time over the last roughly 2,000 years, and it's looking at change in relative sea level. And so we are seeing a rapid change in sea level today compared to, say, 100, 150 years ago. All of this is leading to some of the challenges associated with living in a coastal system, and particularly along North Carolina, and thinking about these storms that we experience, which can drive a lot of energy in the system. And with sea level rise, what we're seeing up and down our coast, and again, it's not just North Carolina, clearly I'm focused on that tonight, but we are dominated along our shorelines by erosion. And some of those erosion rates can be fairly high, upwards of 10, 15 feet per year loss of shoreline, linear loss of shoreline. If you look at the 300 miles of Atlantic shoreline that North Carolina has, approximately 70% of that is eroding. All right, so 70% of our Atlantic shoreline is eroding. On average, that erosion rate sits at about 3 to 5 feet per year. But again, we have these hot spots, and that's what we sort of refer them to, is hot spots. We have these hot spots that are upwards of 10, 15 feet per year. It's a challenge, right? And sort of thinking about what we've created over the last, again, think about since 1960, we've more than doubled our coastal population. Since 1960 and prior to that, these shorelines have been eroding. And so what we're essentially doing is by adding a lot of infrastructure, we're sort of drawing a line in the sand, the proverbial and actual sand. But we have this shoreline that is continually eroding. And so what we're doing is creating a squeeze, right? This idea of a coastal squeeze. Because the infrastructure is not going anywhere, but we have sea level rising, we have all of this energy in the system that's leading to erosion. We don't have a whole lot of new sediment coming into the system that can lead to accretion or that shoreline growing out. And so ultimately what you're doing is shrinking that shoreline and creating this coastal squeeze. This is the case all around the globe, right? There are very few places that aren't seeing this same thing. We want to be close to this resource. And so even if in other locations, even if they aren't experiencing the same sorts of erosion rates, they're still growing out, right? This idea of the infrastructure and commercial and residential development is growing towards the ocean. And so this coastal squeeze is happening everywhere. And you can see it in a couple of images, and of course I grabbed for the Outer Banks, these are two areas that are hot spots for us, right? So the first one, South Nags Head, right? This is around Seagull. This is an area that has been an erosional hotspot for years. Second one is Rodanthe, right around, I didn't pick Merlot Beach just because I can't tell you how many interviews I have done over the last 6 months associated with the loss of those 3 houses since February. These are examples of where we've seen significant shoreline erosion. The data here is actually from the Division of Coastal Management, so it's mapping it's digitized shorelines with time. They actually have out here I believe it's an 1850 shoreline that's digitized from these surveys, these T-sheets from the past. And you can see 1940s, but all the way to not present, but I think the most recent shoreline that it's showing is 2020. And so we do have this coastal squeeze happening today, right? I mean, this is what we're experiencing. And again, recall, from an engineering standpoint, we don't allow hardened shorelines along our coast. And so when thinking about the changes that are taking place along coastal systems, there are several things that you can do moving forward. This is a figure that I grabbed directly from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's focused on things like sea level rise and not just providing you this gloom and doom, but actually looking at potential solutions moving forward. And one of the things I always like to point out is that on the Outer Banks and in many coastal communities, we are already doing many of these. From accommodation, right, the idea of the jug handle. The jug handle is bypassing a very weak point in the barrier. That is accommodating the change that is taking place. And we're seeing, from a scientific point of view, it's really exciting to see that part of the island. Now, again, that's from a scientific point of view. I realize there's other points of view out there, but it's interesting to see that island, that part of the island, go natural. At least it will once they remove the road over the next 4 to 6 weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what that part of the island does. Another example of that was where the current temporary permanent bridge is. Is it the Etheridge Bridge? The Etheridge Bridge? Right? What DOT refers to as the temporary permanent bridge. I mean, that's another example where we sort of allowed the island to go back to a natural state. When you look at the island in that location, which was a very narrow part of the barrier, had a fairly weak dune. Today, dune's still fairly low, but look at the marsh grass. Look how wide the island is in that location. Barrier islands require a few things to stay healthy, if you will, right? A healthy barrier island is one that has elevation, that has width. It needs inlets. It needs these inlets to move back and forth, right? The idea of these flood and tidal deltas create sediment for these barriers. It needs overwash, right? Overwash allows sediment to build height in the barrier and to build width in the back barrier. And it needs longshore currents, right? So we don't want to slow any of that from a natural barrier system, a fairly healthy barrier. The idea, and you know, I've put this image up several times on the Outer Banks. I always cringe when I say retreat, and I know many of you do as well. But the fact is we are doing this. However, whatever we want to call it, this is ongoing. Now, it's not being driven by the community, it's not being driven by the county, but this is ongoing by individuals. The Park Service has done it. You're seeing houses being moved just on their own lots, stepping back as far as they can from the ocean. You're seeing those that have the resources to do it, and this is an important point, those that have the resources to do it are buying another lot and moving their home to a different lot. And so we are going through a form of retreat. Whether we want to admit it or not, it's happening. It's just not at a community level, and it's really not being discussed at community levels. And then the idea of protection or adaptation, depending on how you want to look at it, the idea of beach nourishment, providing some additional protection, adapting to the changes that are taking place. And so for North Carolina, along our beaches, one of the only solutions that we have for adapting to the increased erosion rates is beach nourishment. We don't allow hardened structures, right? In fact, although you can put sandbags when your property is in imminent danger, there are limitations to how long those sandbags, and we could have a discussion about that, some of them remain a long time, but right, there are limitations of what you can do in the way of adding hardened structures on the Atlantic side of our barriers. And so beach nourishment, a soft engineering approach, is about the only thing that we can do to sort of slow, and we'll talk about this a bit more, I'll say for now, slow the rates of erosion. The perception of slowing the rates of erosion. It is considered effective, right? It does work. We'll talk about timescales. I state here environmentally friendlier. And I state it because it's certainly environmentally friendlier than putting in a seawall or other hardened structures. right? It sort of still works with the environment. You have the same processes acting on your coast that you would otherwise, where when you put hardened structures on that beach face, it changes the dynamics. Many of us know it is fairly expensive. We'll talk about that a little bit. And as far as understanding the long-term potential ecological impacts, they're fairly unclear. There haven't been too many studies. In fact, I only know of one that has looked at a nourishment project for longer than about 5 years. All right, so thinking about beach nourishment, these projects are truly designed on the timescales of 5 to 7 years, right? They aren't permanent, and nobody that's building out a beach nourishment project is thinking that they're permanent. They are not a solution to erosion. It is a temporary approach to dealing with the challenge associated with erosion. These projects, for a mile, 2 miles of nourishment will cost millions, tens of millions of dollars. And any of you that are reading the news and have followed the 5 or 6 projects that we have ongoing or have had ongoing on the Outer Banks know that, I think we've spent upwards of $100 million on the Outer Banks this summer. And the other thing I want to point out, because this is this is an important part of a nourishment project that I don't think is often grasped, although I would say that the towns are doing a much better job of trying to sort of go through some of the explanation associated with nourishment. And it's important. The idea that we aren't necessarily focused, the recreation beach is that part of the beach, that dry part of the beach that we love to enjoy day in, day out, where we throw our towels and our umbrellas, right? But there's a large part of a nourishment project that is below that sea level, right? And so they aren't just adding sand to the recreation beach, they are also adding sand beneath sea level, right? So if this is an example of adding a nourishment project, yes, there's a significant amount of sand above mean sea level, but there's a significant amount of sand that is below mean sea level. And right away, one of the things that you'll see within the first several months of a nourishment project is that beach begins to equilibrate. Right? A lot of that sand is directly added to above that water line, but over the first few months, particularly with storms like this, that nourishment program is going to equilibrate between the bar, the offshore bar, right, or bars for that matter, and the recreation beach. And that's an important thing to recognize. You might see what appears to be erosion, a loss of significant sand. Why did we pay $10 million when it's gone in the first 3 months? That sand is not gone. That sand has moved to that offshore bar. Now, I'm not saying during a storm like this you won't lose some of that sand, right? And certainly over time you are losing sand. And that's why the towns do so much monitoring on a quarterly basis. Because if you have a named storm and they can say how much sand they've lost associated with that storm, they can actually recoup some funds through FEMA. And in fact, the nourishment that's taking place in Nags Head this summer, that took place in Nags Head this summer, was primarily from FEMA funds associated with one of the previous storms. Maybe Michael? Don't hold me to that, but one of the previous storms. So these nourishment projects are designed to be temporary, right? Again, 5 to 7 years, and with time, what happens is you do lose some sand associated with some of those processes I just talked about, longshore transport, overwash, some, inlets, right? And particularly storms. When you look at history of nourishment on the Outer Banks, nourishment really is a fairly new process for the Outer Banks. Now, when you look at some of like Pea Island steps back to about 1990. That was really from dredging within Oregon Inlet and some of that sand being put onto Pea Island associated with that terminal groin and a lot of the erosion that was taking place. But when you look at it from the different municipalities, it really started with the town of Nags Head in 2011. And that was at the time, that was the largest locally funded nourishment project in the US. That's pretty impressive for a couple reasons. One, it was really expensive. It was $30+ million or $25+ million. And to have that locally funded was, I think, pretty incredible. And it changed. I really think that particular program changed some of the mindset across the Outer Banks. In 2011, 2012, many of our municipalities and our residents were opposed to nourishment. I'm not saying everybody loves it and wants to do it today, right? I mean, it's an interesting conversation that we can have across the Outer Banks, and I look forward to some of that tonight. But certainly, there are a lot that sort of turned a corner for nourishment after that project, and they saw not just the money that it cost, not just the sand that it put on the beach, but the protection that that offered in the next several storms. And I think the town of Nags Head did a good job of showing that and demonstrating some of the protection that it did provide for infrastructure behind that primary dune, behind that first dune. But when you look at, and this, again, this is only up to 2017, it doesn't include the current nourishment projects, which I do have listed here. So sitting at about 78 million, she's just shy of 100. You know, there's a significant cost associated with this nourishment. And again, recognizing that these are projects that last 5 to 7 years. I also say that beach nourishment, there's a lot of science that goes into developing a beach nourishment project. And we have to think about not just the sand that's being put on the beach, but also where that sand is coming from for us, and I'll show this in just a second. Our sand comes from offshore dredging, basically pumping sand off of these resources just offshore. I'll talk about that a little bit. And it's important to recognize that, you know, it's not, they just can't grab any sand resource. There are guidelines, and in fact, the state of North Carolina defined those even more stringent than just the Corps of Engineers for what is compatible and what is defined as compatible for a beach in North Carolina. And that's not the case for all states, and I'm not saying the reason we have these rules is because there were some nourishments earlier that weren't very compatible, which really led to some problems in the ecology of those beaches in the past. And in fact, I think it's only since just after 2010, I don't remember exactly when that went into place, the CRC, 2012, 2013, something like that, is when these more stringent rules for compatibility went into place. And it looks at the grain size, the size of individual grains for sand that you're putting on. It considers the amount of shell hash, the carbonates that are present, and the size of that shell that's present from what you're pulling. And it looks at the heavy mineral content, right, which can change the color and the temperature of the beach, which is important when you think about turtles. For North Carolina, and we have a data set like this for all of North Carolina, for the Outer Banks, we actually have, and from a perspective of if we're going to continue to do nourishment, if we can afford to do it, we have significant sand resources off of our coast. There are other places, Topsail Island, for instance, that don't. Right? So having these resources within about 2-3 miles of where we're doing nourishment is key for being able to do it, for one, and for trying to keep the costs down as well. And so, I mean, the fact that we do have significant resources is important, recognizing what those are and the data that goes into that, the science going into understanding what these resources are. You know, personally, I think more needs to be done on these borrow areas, right? These are what we referred to as borrow areas. We're borrowing the sand from there to put on our beach. There's not a whole lot of work that's done on the borrow areas themselves. Before or after nourishment, there is some. I think as we start, and I'm sure we will, as some of these borrow areas get considered like Wimble Shoals, Diamond Shoals, these are areas that are likely important from a fishery standpoint, and we should consider that moving forward. For us, this isn't as important, but it's really interesting to think about sand as a limited resource. Living on a barrier island, we're like, get that sand away, right? We got plenty of sand. But across the globe, sand is a limited resource. And in fact, along some coastal communities, they don't have the same sand resources that we have. I'm not saying ours will always be there. We are certainly tapping into those today. But around the globe, this is something that we also need to recognize. It is a limited commodity, and there are people that really want it. And so it's likely to be a challenge, you know, the idea of sand wars moving forward. I don't know if that'll be a show or not, but look for it. And then I think it's also important to recognize that when we think about these shoreline dynamics and how we manage some of the erosion that takes place, it really is this nexus of thinking about the science behind it, the natural environment, clearly the economics, right? I was talking about how much some of these cost, where that money can come from. Whether we should do it or not, right? Really engaging the community from a social science perspective. And then certainly, it's hard to, anytime you bring these other three spheres into it, politics will get involved. And so it really is this interesting dynamic when thinking about building a project, a sand management project, Nourishment. All of this really needs to be considered. It's not just the science, it's not just whether you have the resource available, it's the money that it's going to cost, it's whether we want to do it as a community, and then actually getting through that process of making it happen. And so it really, I think you need to consider that it is a complicated approach to managing this natural process of erosion. All right, so that's sort of the what and why. And then sort of my last part, and then we can sort of get into a little bit of discussion, is talking about the potential impacts. And I said I only know of one study that really has looked at a nourishment project for longer than about 5 years from an ecological standpoint, and that is ours, actually, here on Pea Island. And this is what was a unique opportunity, I think, for the Coastal Studies Institute and those that have been involved in some of this measurement, because it's not often that you really have, particularly for a beach, for a nourishment project, you almost have a lab type setting in what we were able to develop here. So when I talk about the ecology of the beach, what is it that I mean? And those of you that sort of sit and watch the beach, those of you that fish along the beach, this might be pretty obvious. There's actually a lot, and again, let me say outright, I'm not a biologist, right? So I am talking about the ecology of the beach, but I really refer to these as critters, and that's about as far as my biology goes, okay? What we are really looking at is those critters that live in the sands. And it might be in the sands of the swash zone, right? So that area, that intertidal zone. And some of those might be these little polychaetes, right? These are little worms that burrow into coquina. Many of us know coquina. These isopods and amphipods, what look to be like little shrimp. Certainly the mole crabs, anybody that fishes. And then, you can, along the beach itself, right above that high tide line, ghost crabs, we do a lot of hunting for those, right? Or I don't anymore, but my kids did. Sort of thinking about the ghost crabs. We aren't ourselves collecting data on the turtles, but clearly there's a strong turtle network, and we do look at that turtle network data to try and understand potential impacts associated with nourishment. And so you can imagine sort of when you think about all of the infauna, so we refer to these as macrofauna, you can see them, and infauna because they live in the sands. And all of these are fed on by birds, right? They're fed on by fish, crabs, right? So you can imagine sort of, maybe you can't, I try to imagine, and I don't study this, but right, the food network, that food web that sort of can be developed just from this, right? From these little critters that are living in the sand. And it is a critical part of the ecology of the beach. If you get rid of these tiny little creatures that live in the sand, all of a sudden, you aren't going to have the same fish. You aren't going to have the turtle populations. You're not going to have the bird populations, right? So it truly is sort of that bottom of the food web, the food pyramid, whatever you want to call it. It really is important to the ecology and to the sustainability of the ecosystem along a beach. And so I think it's, this is where they aren't necessarily wonderful creatures. They aren't the megafauna like, what we have offshore. And they can take a long time to count at times, but this is what we were studying when I speak to the impacts, the ecology of the beach. These are the critters that we were looking at. So I said, this was a unique opportunity for us. If you recall, back in 2013 and up into 2014, this is a time where S-turns was really eroding away. NC-12 was being overwashed multiple times. In fact, there's images of NC-12 being buckled during a couple storms, right? They were having a hard time holding the ground and maintaining NC-12 at this location. And so they got permission, DOT got permission through Fish and Wildlife and the Park Service to do a nourishment project. And this nourishment project was almost wholly, not completely, but almost wholly within Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge. This is an area that has had little impact except for the road itself, and is managed for the wildlife. But yet, we were able to do this nourishment, and it likely saved DOT millions of dollars in the long run, and it bought them time to build the jug handle. And that was the plan, right? They weren't simply just allowed to go do the nourishment. They had to have a plan in place, and that plan was the jug handle. But what was really interesting about this project is no nourishment had taken place before, and there was no plan for another nourishment, and it was in an area that was protected. And the fact is, as many of you know, is once you get past the sign of Merlot Beach, very few people travel up and down the beach. You can't drive there. And so it really did provide an environment that had an impact, a nourishment, and very little else, right? So we could really look at that one impact and the influence that that impact might have had. And so that gives you some of the information on the project itself. This is the area, right? So what was and continues to be a hotspot, an erosional hotspot, what we've since bypassed, right, through that adaptive process. And what we've been able to do since that 2014 nourishment is we have been surveying the beach in partnership with DOT, looking at the end fauna and some of the other things that I'll talk about ever since, right, through the end of 2021. And so for about 7.5 years, we were collecting sand samples quarterly from this beach. Some of the methods, so first thing I'll point out is this is the area of the nourishment. And so every place you see a star, this is a location where we would do a transect. And then just north of there was an area that was not impacted, right? So this is where was our control. So what we could set up in a fairly small area was an area that wasn't impacted. That's the control. We're taking the exact same measurements. And then just south of there, that's the area that was impacted through this nourishment. Dominant direction of water flow, sediment transport is from north to south. And so that nourishment that took place where they added all that sand likely had very little influence on the beach here, right? Because of that dominant transport from north to south. And so these were the areas that we were sampling and continued to sample for over 7 years. We did transects looking at sort of the topography of the beach, getting an idea of the width of the beach. Using a quadrat, we looked at how many along the beach. We would look at ghost crabs, how many ghost crabs were present, how many, not actual crabs themselves during the day, but their burrow sites. And then we would find the critters through sieving, which is a real pain, to be honest. And so this is sort of how we set this up. So each one of those dots represents a transect, and each transect, this is what we would do. We would have 5 different locations that we would collect samples. We would look at grain size, right, the actual sediments themselves. We would look at the heavy minerals, what color was the sand, how much heavy mineral was there, how much shell hash was there, and what was the average grain size. And then we would also, I'm not going to show any of this data, but we would see the density of that beach, something using a cone penetrometer that you would push into the ground to get some idea of how structurally sound the beach is. Because what can happen is after a nourishment project, you can really compact that sand and create a very hard beach. And then in the swash zone is where we did a lot of the biosampling, right, for the critters. So I'm going to run through just a few of these images to give you some idea of what the data looked like. And each of them are going to look sort of like this. The next one is going to be, next few are going to be box plots. But what it's showing on the x-axis is time. This represents the project start, project end date, right? So that project is referring to when they were pumping on sand. This particular graph is showing beach width. The beach width is from 20 feet to 100 feet. And then the blue represents that control, right? So that area north. And then I guess it's red, the orange maybe, is represented by the treatment. So this is average beach width. What you find, no surprise, is that before the project started, is that the beach width in this treatment area was fairly narrow. No surprise, that's why they needed to do a beach nourishment project. After that nourishment project, it was much wider in that treatment area compared to the control. And note there was very little change in the control, right? So no sand was really added to that control. And then what's interesting is to see how that changed through time to where that project itself, you saw ultimately eroding away. You can start seeing that the control and the treatment sort of matched right here at about 2015. So that was only about a year and a half later. And then what we saw is sort of the separation between the control versus the treatment. Now recall, the treatment area is in one of these hot spots, right? It's an erosional hot spot. It's eroding at 10 feet plus per year. Adding all of that sand to the beach, it doesn't change the process. It's still a hot spot. It's still eroding at about 10 feet per year. And so by adding all of that sand to the beach, increasing the width, what it did was buy you time. And so, it took about 4 years to essentially lose all of that sand that they had added to the point where here and here was about the same, right? So when you get to about 2020, that's when we started seeing a lot more problems with S-turns. We start seeing a lot more overwash, challenges maintaining the bridge, challenges maintaining the road, and then opening the bridge here in 2022. So, this wasn't surprising at all. This is built into a project. The erosion, the process of erosion doesn't stop because you add that sand. Now the question is how, what sand was added, how is it different, and how did it influence the critters? That's what we were really interested in, is the ecology of the beach. A lot of that ecology, and if it changes, is really going to be driven by the sand that you put on the beach. And so what I'm showing in this particular plot is a before and after in the control, and this is looking at average grain size. And so the before is shown in the blue. And so this represents sort of a density diagram of what the grain size, the average grain size on the beach looked like. Underneath that is what the grain size looked like after the project. Now this gets challenging because grain size on a beach changes with season, right? As you move from a quieter period, you're going to have finer grains. When you have more energy in the system, you're going to have coarser grains. And so we do see our beaches change from summer to winter, right? So some of what we're seeing in this plot, the control, is just a product of season, right? So the quiet period, you expect finer sediments. And so on this graph, I don't want to get into the geology, but this is looking at phi, its grain size. Anyway, finer sediments are over here, coarser sediments are over here. And so you would expect to have finer sediments in the summer. As you start moving into the fall and winter, you would expect those sediments to get coarser. And that's sort of what you see in the control. Interestingly, what you see in the treatment, right, is the blue, again, represents pre-nourishment, and then that orange color represents post. The sediments there got finer. And so the sediments added to the beach during that nourishment were finer than what the beach was originally. And so that was one thing that we did see right after that nourishment. The sands on that beach were slightly different. We could get into a discussion of how different, and ultimately this is going to influence the ecology. All right, so that's the crew. This is J.P. Walsh, a colleague of mine that I worked with for a long time, Ian Connery, who was one of our students and now works at the FRF. Spending a wonderful afternoon counting a lot of critters in the swash zone. So I'm going to show 3 different graphs here. So this is looking at the mole crab, and again, I'll orient you with the data. I don't want you to get bogged down in the data. I'm going to show you what I want to show you, but I didn't want to just not show you all the data. It would be unfair. And so this is looking at time. Again, it's an average for a year. So each bar represents either the blue is control, the orange is treatment. So 2014, this represents pre, the 2015 represents post. And one of the things to recognize, and this is where it gets a little bit challenging, is this isn't a year out. This is a year average, and so the 2014 sort of encompasses a little bit of pre, a little bit of post. The one thing to recognize for the mole crabs is we do look at different size classes, right? Those that are just recruiting versus those that are adults. And I should state that none of these have very long life cycles, right? The life cycles of the critters that I'm showing you are on the order of months. When you look at the difference of what happened, sort of what you saw in the pre-nourishment period versus the post, for these particular critters, it's hard to make a real distinction based on the data. Did it impact it? The likely impact was probably just on the smaller of those that were recently recruited, and maybe a small impact on those larger ones, but difficult to tease out statistically. When you look at the coquina, again, when you start looking at trends, very difficult to actually see a significant impact when you start looking at the control, right, versus the treatment area. Now, certainly you're seeing changes with time, but you're seeing those changes at the control and the treatment. Now, the ghost crab is an area where we did see a significant difference, where you saw a significant decline in the amount of ghost crabs on the beach, post-nourishment. And that lasted for a little while. And again, I'll sort of summarize this, but I didn't want to just summarize it without showing you that we actually have the data. And so when you think about the ecology of the beach and these critters, what we saw is, there was some change in the physical characteristics, right? So we did see a slightly finer sand that was pumped on the beach compared to that native beach. There was no clear evidence from the coquina and the mole crabs. With the smallest of the mole crabs, maybe a slight decline, but really hard to say anything statistically. The ghost crabs certainly did show a decline, although it didn't last very long. And within about a year later, you couldn't tell a difference between the control and the treatment. And some of the other critters, right, so the amphipods, the worms, the polychaetes, we just didn't, in the control or the treatment, you just can't find enough to say anything statistically, right? There's just not many there when we were sampling in the areas that we were sampling. And so what's interesting is we didn't see major impacts associated with this fairly large project. And so we sort of stepped back and tried to think about why. What was it about this particular project that didn't lead to significant impacts? And in fact, if there were any impacts, within 6 to 8 months, you couldn't tell the difference between the treatment and the control. And so if there were impacts, they were not long-lived. You go out there today, you cannot tell the difference between the control and the treatment. And so that's, I think, fairly interesting. And we can get into discussions of what that really means, particularly in areas where we're doing nourishments every 5 to 7 years. This was one nourishment done at one point in time, and we happened to monitor that for 7+ years. Now, if you're starting to do nourishments every 3, every 5 years, could there be an impact? Potentially. However, what we saw is for what we were measuring, there was a return to, quote, normal, right, to what that or what the controls look like within a year's time. And so if my gut would say that if you're doing these nourishments every 3 to 5 years, if the recruitment is taking place and you're going back to this base level within a year, if it can really take that turn within a year, then you're likely going to have not a significant impact if you are extending that as beyond about 5 years. So what was the key to success? I really do think that this particular project, although it was slightly finer, compared to some other nourishment projects, it was a good match. The compatibility was really good. There wasn't a large difference in the sediment that was put on the beach. And that sediment was put on the beach like every project is done. You essentially design that beach to have the same sort of morphology as the beach that would be native. And so you didn't change the beach that much from a grain size perspective, from the color of that beach, to the amount of shell material that was on that beach, or the design of that beach. And so they matched it pretty well, and I give them credit for that. There are a lot of examples in North Carolina and beyond that haven't had a good match of their sand. That is key to have a successful nourishment project. We aren't there yet. We haven't seen a project like that on the Outer Banks yet. I'm not saying that you don't see a difference when you go out pre-nourishment versus post-nourishment at your favorite beach access. You'll see a difference, right? Visually, there's a difference. What's important is getting into the grain size, understanding how much heavy mineral in the shell hash. That's what's key. The actual color, right? It's been on the ocean floor for the last millennia, and so you're going to see differences there. All right, so sort of just summarize, what is it? What do we talk about beach nourishment? Why? I mean, ultimately it comes down to, some sort of erosion protection and protecting the infrastructure behind that primary dune. And for many beach communities, is it economical, right? Are we doing it just for the tourism? I don't think so, particularly when you think about and look at some of the protection that it has provided in those communities that have done nourishment in the past. And the potential impacts. What we've shown, at least with this study, this long-term study, is there was very little impact to the beach. Now, I don't want to say that nourishment is never going to be impactful, and there are plenty of examples where it is. And I think what's key is that we continue to follow those guidelines of trying to match as best we can. Certainly it would be better if we did our nourishment projects in the winter, not in the summer. That would, from an ecology standpoint, that is actually what would be required. There's challenges for us in doing nourishment projects in the winter because of the storms that come through. And that's why we are given, we're sort of given a pass and allowed to do them in the summer. And so there's ways that we could try to manage this a bit better, but there are challenges associated with that as well. And so I'll end with, how do we move forward, right? Are we going to do this forever? I'm not going to give an answer to that. I think we're going to start getting into those discussions real soon. Particularly with what happened this summer and the number of projects that we had and the amount of money the county and the individual towns have spent to put sand on the beach, right? $78 million spent this summer on these nourishment projects. At some point, because of increased sea level rise, that rate is increasing. We're going to start seeing, and we can start measuring, how shoreline erosion rates are also going to change moving forward. Again, think about that coastal squeeze. We've been seeing that for the last several decades. As the rate of sea level rise increases, that coastal squeeze is going to become more and more of a challenge. And it's not going to be 7 years. It's not going to be 5 years. It might be 3 years that you have to do that next project. Or it may be that you have to double the amount of sand that you're putting on the beach in order for it to last 5 to 7 years. And when you do that, the price goes up. So all of these things we're going to have to start thinking about. The number of communities that want sand on their beach, right? We have a community right now that would love to have sand on their beach, right? Revamped. It's a challenge from the economic standpoint. So that's where these discussions need to start happening. When thinking about how our system's going to change moving forward, we have to start thinking about and having those challenging discussions of how we're going to move forward. When it comes to the beach itself, the front side, we're fairly limited on what we can do. And so it may be that we have to think about some of these other things, how we might accommodate, how we might raise houses, how we might continue, whether it's individually or provide some incentives to think about how we potentially retreat. And when I say retreat, I'm not saying we all pack up and move. That's not what we're saying, right? Again, we're seeing retreat on the Outer Banks today. So don't start throwing things at me yet. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you. Again, we are sort of live streaming, so Parker's coming around with the mic just so anybody that's online can hear your questions. And if there's anybody that's online that wants to ask a question, you can type that in as well.
We have several online questions, but let's take some in the audience first.
Oh, you go first. So the dunes. Mm-hmm. Dunes is a protection measure.
Primary dune is key to the protection.
And also then would prevent a retreat measure because sand naturally would carry to the west and extend our retreat. We could keep moving back to the west as the natural progression would go. So if nourishment is going to be a strategy, are the dunes helpful or really working against that? Because I also see it as the water hits that dune and maybe makes more of a turbulent area there and creates more of a runoff, like a steeper retreat for water to move sand back out. So I guess the dunes still fit into a strategy if we're going to keep using nourishment. The
dunes are going to be, as they always have been, certainly moving forward, they are going to be our primary, right? That really is that primary, I'll call it a wall of defense, right? It really does protect infrastructure behind there. When they build nourishment projects, some of it comes into the economics associated with the project, whether they can build that dune or not. Many communities don't actually have them construct the dune. The communities go in and plant afterwards to try and build their own dune, and that's just a cost savings is what it comes down to. But in any time a project is built, any time a community wants to think about that first line of defense, it is that dune. And when it comes, when you start thinking about that, the erosive, how the ocean does erode away at the shoreline, it is that volume of sand that is so critical. The volume of sand between the shoreline and whatever infrastructure is behind it, that's what's key for protecting that infrastructure. And a way of creating more sand volume is by piling it, right? Is creating that first dune, creating that line of defense. And so it will always be an important part of protection for all the infrastructure behind. I mean, your question's deeper than that because it gets into the idea of, naturally what you would do is overwash that dune, put sand in the back barrier. That happens during storms. Post-storm, what would happen is you would still have grasses there, that dune would build back up, right? Naturally, that's what happens. Today, we don't want that sand to go behind we want the sand back on the beach, right? And so anytime we have some sort of overwash, whether it's in the town or look along, NC12, we push it back up onto the front line because it adds that volume, it leads to the protection. And people don't want it in their pools and yards.
Thank you very much. I remember being fascinated with this in the early, mid-'80s. A little science fair project on beach erosion. I made the little water tank with the lighthouse and such. But I think
come do some of our community things.
Yeah, I think it was
rebuild it.
Yeah, I think it was spurned though by some conversations on early beach nourishment, and I think in those days we were talking more about just pushing sand back up on the beach with the bulldozers, tractors, and such. But there was also a secondary measure of a multi-layer approach to keeping that sand, and some of that was. I remember in particular, and this is my question more so, if there's researcher looking into this, after you push the beach back up, there was almost like a Tyvek type material that had floats on it, and it would act as a moving barrier, if you will, or like a sand fence, but further offshore. So that would protect the sand from going so far out or create something of a shore break, if you will, and it wasn't a hard structure. Is there anything like that being looked at? Is that part of a multi-layer approach to getting it back and then keeping it or softening the blow of the waves?
This would be something that's actually either in the swash zone or further out.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are these, I think there's a lot of, the short answer is I don't know. But let me elaborate. And so there are some things that are being, geotubes, for instance, right, which do sit just offshore. And the idea with the geotube, which is a soft engineering structure, it is a structure. The idea is to try and trap some of that sand before it makes it out beyond closure, right, where you lose the sand from your beach. And I'm not aware of the design that you were speaking to. There have been other things in the past, and I say past, many decades ago, that have been used, right? Off of Emerald Isle, they tried to use old tires. And if anybody remembers that, they had a lot of tires on their beach not too long after they put those out. And so there's been a lot of things that have been tried. I think in many cases, anytime you're working with those sorts of products, I think what you're challenged with is the amount of energy in the system such that you don't end up with just littering the ocean, littering your beach with whatever you've just put out because of the energy in the system. Yes, sir.
I'm new here, so I'll ask a question. I understand hard engineering structures, the aesthetics of them is not particularly good. But why was it just categorically ruled out?
So hard structures, when you think about vertical structures or those structures that go out perpendicular to the beach, so groins and jetties and the like, they change the natural currents, they change the natural transport of sediments, and ultimately on time scales of multiple years, they lead to increased erosion. Maybe not right at the location of that particular structure, but your neighbor or the neighbor down from there, right? So you can't trap sand using a groin without leading to further erosion downfield, right? Sand is constantly moving. It's constantly moving down. For us, it's from north to south. And so if you put up a hardened structure in one location, you're starving that sand further downfield. And so that's the challenge associated with building some of these hardened structures. When you look at vertical structures, seawalls, right? Those, just like what we were speaking to about the idea of increasing turbulence along the beach, those will create increased erosion right at the base of those vertical structures, leading to increased erosion. And then what ends up happening is these vertical structures fall into the ocean. They need to be cleaned up. You need to add more to it. And you can see this along the sound side. We have a lot of vertical structures on the sound side. It's the same challenge along the sound side. And you see the same processes happen. Maybe not as fast because you don't have the same energy in the system. But that's the challenge associated with these vertical structures. And it's been, there's plenty of documentation of that. You can go to many other beaches, and I won't name any other state like New Jersey or something where you can go and see that. Because, it's there, right? There's plenty of evidence of what these hardened vertical perpendicular structures will do to a beach. It may protect a location, but ultimately you've changed the entire dynamics of the entire sort of beach that you're working with.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Parker?
All right, one from online. Does it make sense to explore a multifaceted solution to coastal erosion that includes fill, artificial reefs to mitigate wave energy at the beach and enhance biological habitat and retreat? It's a long question.
Yes. Hodie. Yeah, I think the only way, we're not, to the engineers in the audience, sorry, I don't think we're going to engineer our way out of this challenge that we face in the next 10, 20, 60 years. Whatever time frame you want to put on it. We're seeing changes today. Anybody that's lived on the Outer Banks for the last several decades has likely, and I'd be interested to know those, if I'm wrong, tell me, but you've seen changes that you haven't before. Yes, there's always been storms. Yes, there's been erosion. But in the last 70 years, we've seen a 1-foot rise in sea level. In the next 30 years, we're going to see another 1-foot rise in sea level. We're not going to get out of this simply by adding more sand to the beach. We are going to have to think about this from a multifaceted approach. And it needs to include conversations across the entire community. It needs to include some of the challenging conversations associated with some of these properties that are likely too vulnerable to rebuild the next time they get knocked down. That's a hard conversation to have, particularly if somebody's been in that house for multiple generations. And it's their property. I'm not saying they can't. But we should have that conversation. And I do think the Outer Banks is, this community has been around here and has always worked together. I think there's ways that we can get together and have these challenging conversations. And I think it's important that we use some of the science to help guide that, right? We know some of these processes. We understand the rates at which things are changing. We have a very good idea of what sea level is going to do in the next 30 years. Those aren't questions anymore. Yeah, when we go out 60, 70 years, that's where we can get into arguments, discussions, right? Rich discussions. But 30 years from now, we have a pretty good idea what it's going to look like. And so we don't need to argue about that. What we need to do is have a discussion what we're going to do about it. And it's not going to be just beach renourishment. It's going to have to be multifaceted.
All right, one more from online. How much of the erosion of the beaches and dunes is caused by wind compared to storm surf and high surf energy?
When it comes to erosion of the beaches, very little is caused by wind. In fact, wind helps build these beaches, right? Wind, aeolian transport is really important for building these beaches through time. And so our erosion is really driven by differences in geology, right? Which I didn't really get into, the idea where we have some old inlets that have filled in. Those are some weak parts in the barrier. But the amount of energy together with sea level rise is what's really driving that shoreline erosion on the front side. Do you have a question?
Oh, I was wondering about the mining that's offshore. How
Yes,
is
ma'am.
that changing the topography? And the
That's a great question.
back inshore? And then also, you didn't discuss the aquatic life?
Yeah, again, I don't know anything about aquatic life. So I'll get to the first question, which is the idea that we have all these borrow areas, we are taking sand from those. What's really interesting, if you look at some of these borrow areas, some of these shoals where we're taking the sand, I mean, there truly is an enormous amount of sand. And what we have taken from those to date, right, is a drop in the bucket. And so yes, right at the location where they're drawing from that sand, right after that nourishment that takes place, you will see a change in topography that likely over a couple months with storms like this, you will see that topography go back to some sort of natural state. Now, I do think it's important, particularly when we start getting into some of these shoals like Wimble shoals, diamond shoals, that we do think about the importance of those shoals, those sand shoals for fish habitat, because they are thought to be areas where fish go to breed. And so, I mean, I think that's an important thing that really hasn't been in large discussions. I mean, I know it's been brought up occasionally. I think it needs to, as we start using these resources a bit more, I think it needs to come out a bit more for further discussion and probably more research done around those areas. You're right, I didn't really touch on the fish, nearshore fish associated with this. And to be honest, I don't have any data associated with it. And I would have to leave it to my colleagues to do any of that work. And I'm not aware of any work that has been done sort of in these nourishment areas associated with some of the nearshore fish. Yes, sir.
I've heard people make the argument that it'd be better off not having the dunes there because let the wave action come up and dissipate over the island, dumps more sand on the backside. Is there anything to that?
To be honest, I haven't heard that. I think it'd be interesting to give that argument to that infrastructure in the first couple rows. I think they would argue against that.
It's up in old Nags Head area.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, you know, the fact is, again, those dunes are that sort of first line of defense. Yeah, I mean, if you were to lower those dunes, overwash is easier. You're going to move sand further across. I mean, that's true. But behind those dunes and our system is infrastructure. And so by allowing that water, by allowing that energy, by allowing that sand into your infrastructure, you're not going to just leave it there, right? I mean, ultimately it will need to get cleaned up and, you know, and everything else associated with any kind of an overwash event. And so, yeah, I mean, by allowing these waves to go over the dunes, dissipate some of that energy, I'm not saying it wouldn't be better for the barrier. And in fact, naturally, that's what these barriers would do. But we don't have a natural barrier over much of our barrier islands. And so, you know, that's what we have to take into consideration is that we have significant infrastructure behind that first dune. And allowing that dune to break, allowing that dune to lower in some of these areas is going to lead to a lot more problems than just the erosion on the underside of that dune. And we're seeing that in some places, right? I mean, that's why some of these houses have fallen in the water. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering what your thoughts are of allowing a few more inlets to allow the pressure off of some of this, if that would be something that may help.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, again, we have a fairly unique system with a huge estuarine system that doesn't have a whole lot of river flow, right? So when you compare our rivers, you add up all of our rivers together, and the flow is at more than an order of magnitude lower than the Mississippi. When you add all of our rivers, including Cape Fear, right? So we don't have a whole lot of river flow. I'm going somewhere with this. And we have a huge estuarine system. And so right now we have, 3 inlets in the northern part of the barriers. You know, one of the interesting things, and this has come up a couple times, and I think it's, scientifically it's really interesting, and I can't say that I have any data to back any of this up. So maybe I shouldn't even say it, but I'm going to. You know, when Nunu Inlet, Split Pea Inlet, whatever you want to call it, opened, right? There was some interesting conversations going on about, you know, at that time when that inlet was open, and it widened pretty fast. It was 40 plus feet deep. There was a lot of water moving through it. There was suggestions that what people saw was Oregon Inlet at the time started shoaling more. Again, I can't say one way or the other. We don't have any data to say one way or the other. You know, it's sort of thinking and talking with people in the community. The fact is we don't have, you know, what really holds and will sustain these inlets is how water moves in and out, right? How water moves in and out. And on a normal, you know, Outer Banks day, we don't have enough water moving in and out between the Atlantic and the Albemarle Pamlico to sustain any more inlets than we have. And you actually will see that, right? That inlet, Split Plea, New Inlet, it closed on its own, right? We didn't fill that. It was really interesting to watch. It was one of the first time I can remember that DOT allowed NC-12 to be split, and they just let it go. They built a temporary bridge and a temporary permanent bridge over it. It was incredible to watch how quick that changed, right? So inlets have opened up, but they close. And part of that is a product of the dynamics of this system. If we had larger rivers and a lot more fresh water coming through, then you would likely see another inlet stay open. When we have these inlets open up, it typically is a sound side event. It isn't breaking through from the Atlantic, typically. What it is just like you suggested. You have all of that water piling up on the backside, you find a weak point in the barrier, it breaks through, and it opens up that inlet from the backside. And so during these storms is when that happens because of the amount of energy, the amount of water sitting on the backside of the barrier. But on a, you know, sort of a typical day, we just don't have that sort of water flow to maintain the inlet. And so it just, at this point, you're not going to see them stay open. Yes, sir.
Do you think the temporary bridge had an effect on that inlet closing back up?
That's an interesting question. So like the pilings and things led to increased sand being deposited in that area? Is that sort of?
Not only that, but the temporary pontoons, the way it was set up and everything, do you think it had, before they built the temporary bridge?
When they had the Lego bridge.
Right, the old Lego bridge.
Yeah. The short answer is I don't think so. It might have played a role in the short run. That would have been, in my opinion, localized to, you know, where some of that was laid out. But generally, I think what you saw is that barrier, it had a lot of water moving through it at the time. And as we would expect for that particular area, when it allowed to go, you know, sort of move naturally, it did fill, it did add sand, and it did create, I mean, that was driven by the amount of sand that was placed on the back barrier. It created this flood tide delta. And when you look at the imagery through time, what you were doing is piling, not sand right where that bridge was, the Lego bridge, but sand behind the barrier. And ultimately, you just kept adding sand behind the barrier, which created until it went forward. That's right.
Right. Are you familiar with the new inlet where it cut through down in Buxton, Hatters?
Yes. Yeah, north of Buxton.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, they just pumped that one right back in, you know.
Yeah. That's because it was a breach. It wasn't an inlet. If you call it a breach, you can fill it back in. It's interesting, the difference.
Well, see, that's where the politics comes in on all of this.
What?
You look at the houses along the beach there, and you see all of those tax dollars that Dare County is collecting.
I don't know what you're talking about. Another question?
Might not like this one. What are the models of paying for this? How does the Outer Banks compare to other areas of the country and internationally?
And so how does the Outer Banks compare nationally? I mean, again, the Outer Banks, this is one thing again, I've done a lot of interviews over the last 6 months, particularly with, because of the houses that fell in. And what's really interesting is why is this happening on the Outer Banks? You know, the Outer Banks is eroding away. You know, what's going on? Like, this is not an Outer Banks issue, right? This is happening everywhere. So from that respect, you know, what we're dealing with, how we're approaching this is very similar to coastal communities across the U.S. and certainly around the world. In North Carolina, we're a little bit different because we don't allow certain things along our ocean front. As far as, you know, the models, the financial models, to how we might maintain this forward. One of the things that has happened in the last couple of years is, particularly in the northern beaches, they really have gotten together and really started communicating about nourishment and tried to get their projects on the same schedule. That's saving millions of dollars, right? When you put a project together, about a third of the cost is just mobilizing and demobilizing, bringing all that equipment in and moving all that equipment out, including the barges, the pipes, and everything else. That's about a third of the price. Again, for a $30 million project, $10 million is just moving stuff around, right? So when these communities work together, you're saving millions of dollars. So that's key. One of the challenges will be, do we maintain a 5 to 7 year plan? If it starts getting below 5 to 7, it's really 5 years. I'll stop saying 7, because really I don't think we're on a 7-year plan anymore. It really is a 5-year timetable. If we start getting below 5 years, I think the county, and again, I'm not going to speak for the county, so notice I said I think. I think we start running into some challenges financially. And right now it's sort of, I think they've been able to work it out financially for those, again, I'm speaking about the northern beaches, for those communities that don't have the same tax base, they don't pay as much, the county pays more. For those communities that have a higher tax base, they're paying 50% of their projects. And they've been able to work that out across the communities, which I give them a lot of credit for, because anytime you bring up money, right, that's when you can really start arguing, whether you're in a family or a community. And so they have been able to really work that out, and I think everybody's on the same page of how they will move this forward. The question is do we maintain the same tax base? Are we bringing in the same amount of dollars every year that will ultimately support the sand nourishment taking place in the future? And at what time frame are we having to do it? Does it go to 4 years? Are we able to continue 5 years, and for how long? And I know the county is thinking about this. I talked to Bobby a couple days ago about it, and they do have a financial model in place that does work. And it works out into the future, and I can't tell you at what point their model stops working. I don't know. And I didn't ask him either. So, all right, one last question. Oh, tough one.
Okay, so to piggyback onto that, so as other communities come on board with beach nourishment in their county, how does that model work out well into the future? And is it worthwhile to look at an overall master plan with a long view of 30 to 50 years, similar to what Carteret County has done?
Yes. I mean, how can we not look out 30 years, right? Again, we know the processes that are driving this change. We can plan for volumes. We can think about the finances. We have a pretty good idea where we're headed in the direction of tourism. Hopefully it won't continue to grow the way it has. Yes, we should be planning 30 to 50 years out. Yes, we should start considering some of these other communities that are going to need the same nourishment that some of the northern towns are getting, and that should be planned into the model as well. So, yes, David, you're right.
And I know that you started that conversation, but it's just trying to get buy-in from everybody, which is the critical path.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to have these conversations. What we're trying to do at CSI is initiate some of those conversations as well with you, with some of our Outer Banks leaders, right? I think it's important that we start doing it. So, yeah. With that, I appreciate you all coming. Spread the word. And again, we'll